Okay, let's see how we do here. This is going to be a long one. The history of slavery in the Americas, or slavery in American history. Unfortunately, it's a long history and it's ongoing. I'm going to start from the beginning uh, to the end of the Civil War, and hopefully I can get this done in, let's see what my estimate is. At 23 seconds in right now, I think we're probably going to be 55 minutes to get through this. So let's see how accurate that is. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Race, not, since the beginning of time, people have been racist. That's not true. The idea of race didn't even exist, at least not in our modern understanding of it. It doesn't exist before the 15th century. And it emerges for very specific reasons. Imperialism, the contact of European powers with people very much not like them. The Reconquista, reconquest, which begins this notion of, at least in Spain, we are Catholic, we are Spanish. How are these Muslims and these Jewish Spaniards not like us? We need to make sure that we create some kind of distance between us. And then the Enlightenment, which is all about making categories, categorizing things, studying things, and putting things in their little respective boxes. So in Spain, you have the casta system. The casta system is actually emerges in the old world with the notion of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, which was applied to Muslim and Jewish converts after Spain had reconquered the Iberian Peninsula. And then they take that idea and they transfer it over to the Americas, except it's not about religion anymore. It's about these like different kind of groups of people, right? People that are the product of mixed race marriages or mixed race relationships. And it's not to say that they existed already. They certainly didn't. They make categories as these new races emerge. They make categories to put them in, right? So it's not like the race exists and then they catalog it. They create the catalog based on what they see, right? And as what they see, like once they catalog it, it becomes a specific thing, like the category of like mulatto, coyote, or like all of these other various morisco, all of these various like categories emerge because they're trying to see where people fit. Obviously, the whitest are on top. Peninsulares are like the white, like not just white, but like born in Spain. If your parents are both from Spain, and your older brother is born in Spain, and they get on a boat, and mom's pregnant, you go across to the Americas, and you're born the day after you arrive, you're not a Peninsulare. You're a criollo, a Creole. So this is a way to institute white supremacy, and that's the Spanish system. Who else do we have here? In the background here just is not really relevant, but I have these are images of racial categories from the American census. So you'll see how these categories change, right? That it's not the races that kind of prefigure the categories. The categories create the races. So what else is happening? As we know, hopefully from review, the three kinds of imperial powers have three kinds of doing empire. For Spain, it's resource extraction. For France, it's kind of trapping and trading of furs, making alliances with Native Americans. And then for the English, it's settler colonialism. So those are the three kinds of empire. And I'm only including this older stuff because apparently they've asked some questions on the first paper exam on the AP. They asked some kind of like really like period one type stuff. So I want to include some of this for you. So all three empires, as they have different kinds of empire, they have different kinds of racial taxonomies. Again, for the Spanish, white on top, dozens of categories below, that's white supremacy. For the French, this notion of intermarriage to improve the races, certainly to improve Native Americans. That's also white supremacy insofar as they're saying, you're lucky to intermarry with us. And then for the English, it's building walls between English settler colonists and Native Americans. That's also white supremacy. So it's three different kinds of empire, three different kinds of white supremacy. They look different, but they're all white supremacy. Race is constructed over a very specific period of time, so it takes a couple hundred years before we get this modern notion of race. And as you see, race is different, right? Race isn't a fixed category. It's different in the Spanish colonies than it is in the French colonies or the English colonies. And lastly, once we move into these categories of kind of racial hierarchy, we start to see what emerges is a notion of like who's on the lowest of the low. And what we'll see is it is people who are stolen from Africa and brought to the New World. And they are made slaves. And that kind of, although slavery has existed for a very, very, since, I don't want to say since the beginning of time, but like since, certainly as far back as we study in, say, Patterns of Civilization or AP World. But the slavery in the New World is different. It's different because a couple of reasons. One, it's not primarily domestic. So they have slavery in Greece, they have slavery in Rome, but it's not agricultural slavery. It's not people out working in fields. It's domestic slavery. It's someone who, cleans up your house or helps with your kids or helps you in your kind of little shop or whatever if you're a kind of artisan. It's not tens or dozens or hundreds of people out in the field doing agricultural labor. And also, it's not race-based and heritable, which the New World slavery is unique because it's race-based. One specific race are slaves. That's not the case in Rome. Anyone could be a slave, right? Or Greece. And then it's heritable. So that is to say, if you're enslaved, your children are born enslaved. Right. And again, that is not the case in Rome, not the case in Greece, not the case in all other kinds of slavery that we see throughout history. So again, race-based heritable slavery is what the English introduce to the history of slavery and to the New World. Why are they getting these Africans? Why are they abducting Africans from West Africa and bringing them to the New World? Well, the initial idea was that they were going to use poor English, as kind of indentured servants that would serve a period of time and then be free once they're done. But didn't work out because the whole idea of the Magna Carta and England thinks they're better than everyone else. Well, these English indentured servants, they thought that they had a certain, they had also the ability to claim their own freedom once their contract of indenture was up. They wanted property. So they kind of wanted the terms and conditions that they had signed up for. They wanted their overseers to follow through with them. Overseers didn't want to do that, and that's a problem. So they start enslaving Africans, and as it turns out, in spite of the kind of English cultural superiority, thinking that, these Africans don't know anything about freedom, they don't know anything about property, they wanted it too. So they start suing for their freedom, they inherit property, they start building their own kind of economies, and that's a problem. So how do you deal with this emerging class of black, formerly indentured, now free people? You create slave codes that codify race-based slavery, heritable slavery. And the first ones we have are in Barbados, the Barbados Slave Codes of 1661, which again provides, this is the first time we see if you're black, you're a slave. If you're the child of a black person, you're a slave, right? So that is the first time we see that. And then it is exported to South Carolina, also to Virginia. In Virginia, another layer is added, and that is partus sequitur ventrum. That is like your status goes with the status of your mother. So in English common law, right, a male heir is the heir to all the property, all the inheritance of the father. Obviously, that's a problem when you have English colonists raping enslaved African women and having children with them, that if there's a male heir, you can't give them all your property. So they come up with this partus sequitur ventrum, which says it's the mother's status, right, that determines if you're black, not if you're white, but if you're black, it's the mother's status that determines whether you're free or enslaved. Nothing in English common law, right, says you can do this. And then also a few years later, Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, which is a kind of multi-ethnic, multiracial rebellion against the governor of Virginia at that time, Governor Berkeley, shows that poor black and poor white, when they work together, have a lot of power. Can't have that again. So Bacon's Rebellion, after that, we have more laws that create a kind of notion of chattel slavery. So chattel slavery is another layer to this, and that is to say that right, chattel means property, like in the 17th century or 18th century, even 19th century, right? You would, in a list of your chattel would be, the house, your house, like the farm implements, the cows, but also in the South, enslaved laborers. So that means that enslaved laborers are the property of someone else, right? And this creates a division between poor white and enslaved black. Okay, centuries-long genocide, part one, the slave trade. You have 1,000 Africans abducted per year in the 17th century. By 1861, you have 11 million people coming over, so much so that it's actually, as it says here, there's more Africans and Europeans coming to the Americas in 1831. Many die in transit. 1.5 million die in transit from disease, from suicide. People jump overboard all the time. There's slave insurrections and people are killed. Of those who survive, there's a lot, at least 1/3 die in the seasoning camps where they were worked very, very hard, and a lot of them succumb to disease and fatigue, exhaustion. We don't know in West Africa how many die in conflict. So these numbers only indicate the people that made it onto a boat. That does not indicate how many died in conflicts in West Africa. And then once you make it through all of this, you're enslaved for life. Needless to say, all of West Africa is destabilized. So again, AP World stuff here, but like when you study the scramble for Africa, as it's lightheartedly referred to, you have to understand that why Africa, West Africa in particular, was so susceptible to colonization is because, its entire political, social, and cultural structure had been uprooted, right, over the course of a couple hundred years. Okay, 17th, 18th century slavery. Again, a lot of folks say, oh, erasing history this, erasing history that. You tear down a statue, it's erasing history. Calling a plantation is erasing history. This is a labor camp. I mean, what else is it? I mean, if we're looking at the actual facts of the matter, are these people servants to a planter and a mistress? If anything is erasing history, it's the kind of language that we use to describe chattel slavery and the enslaving of human beings. I mean, these are labor camps. People are enslaved. There are enslavers. So that's an important point to remember here. I mean, maybe not for AP review, but if you have a question and you're talking about slavery, the language you use is always political, whether you think it is or not. So this is just to kind of make it manifest that if you're calling someone a planter, that's a political statement. If you call someone an enslaver, that's a political statement, right? One way or another. Um, so the facts on the ground, there's a couple centers of enslaved labor. The Chesapeake is one. I've talked about this. Chesapeake is task labor system, largely tobacco. Is more escape because it's closer to the free states or free colonies, I suppose, at this point. And then South Carolina is the other major epicenter of enslaved labor. This is rice. This is the gang labor system, fewer escapes. However, there are so many enslaved laborers in South Carolina because effectively it's a similar culture to Barbados, and enslaved laborers are coming over by the thousands from Barbados every year, and even directly from Africa. They do forge a kind of unique culture that is kind of like very like mixed, but like very African, very Caribbean, just because there's so many of them. Where in the Chesapeake, you don't get that. You get more of a kind of like the culture of enslaved laborers is mixed with enslaved laborers, and like they're more Christians, and things like that. And in our book, it talks about planters hitting upon rice cultivation. That's not true. Rice cultivation actually, which is the major staple crop in South Carolina, is actually originated in West Africa. It's a West African thing, and West African enslaved laborers begin the rice cultivation in South Carolina. There is no Deep South yet. So again, if we're talking about the 17th and 18th centuries, that's to say 1600s, 1700s, there's no like Alabama doesn't exist, right? Mississippi doesn't exist. So cotton is not a thing. If we're talking about slavery in the colonial world, cotton is not a thing. Does not really exist yet as a major factor in the economy. Okay. Black resistance before white assistance, a important lesson in who ends slavery. You have slave ship mutinies, 485 that we know of, suicides, people jumping overboard, killing themselves on board, work slowdowns in the labor camps of the New World. A lot of enslaved laborers would poison their enslavers, either to kill them or just to punish them using, I guess kind of natural herbs and things that they knew about from West Africa, or also there was a dialogue between native communities and enslaved laborers. Slave insurrections, Haiti being the most famous, the most successful slave insurrection in history. They created their own democracy. Nat Turner, in the background here, the kind of violence, 1830s Virginia. Then you have the formation of maroon communities, Native Americans taking in escaped enslaved laborers, freedom suits in the English colonies. This is enslaved laborers suing for their freedom. And then by the late 1700s, right, the 1760s, 70s, right? So again, we've had from really since the beginning, since the early 1600s, you have black, right, or African resistance to slavery. By, about 200 years later, you get Quakers outlawing slavery, British abolitionists beginning to push back against slavery. So again, this notion that it's somehow Europeans or English people that end slavery, that's not true, right? It's not true. They're late to the party, and they are the last kind of movement against slavery, but they're certainly not the most important one. Okay, agency in enslaved communities. You get a question about slavery and enslaved communities, you can talk about agency. Agency is not to say that slavery isn't bad. Y'all kill me with this one. That like, if I say, oh, white Southerners were delusional and they thought that the enslaved laborers were their friends. And what you hear from that is like, oh, white Southerners, they didn't know slavery was bad. And, maybe slavery wasn't so bad. That's not what we're saying here. So, like, again, with agency, the notion of agency, just because enslaved communities can create spaces of freedom does not mean that slavery is in any way, shape, or form good. It's just not like on the one hand, on the other hand. This is not that, right? This is to say that, like, even in the most dire, depressing, right, circumstances, people can find spaces, right, to remind themselves that they're still human beings, even in circumstances where everything is set up to push that away. They still can, be human. So what does that mean? Freedom, community. A lot of enslaved communities try to recreate West African traditions. There is a lot of, many of these slaves are Muslims, so they continue on with their religious practices, or they blend religious practice from West Africa with new traditions from the Caribbean. They continue on with the culture and music, cooking, language. All of these various things are rooted in West African culture, the banjo, blues, rice cultivation, peanuts, sesame, fried food, inoculations, right? So the Muslim world, including West Africa, was inoculating people against viruses way before Europe was. So again, all of these things, the reason we have this stuff at all, or in the Americas at least, is because of this notion of agency, that even though the slave system was engineered and designed to take away the humanity of enslaved laborers, they were still human, and they reminded themselves and they found spaces to be human, and to continue on with culture wherever they could. This is what it looks like, right? It's a lot of enslaved laborers. You're familiar with the triangular trade. This is one part of the triangle. Millions and millions of enslaved Africans stolen from West Africa, the region completely destabilized, and shipped to the Americas. Millions of them dying in transit, millions of them dying once they get to the Americas. Not a good system. However, by the late 1700s, we get people, enslaved Africans, suing for their freedom and winning. There's nowhere in English common law that says slavery is allowed. And enslaved laborers start suing for their freedom and winning. The most famous is Somerset versus Stewart in 1772. In which an enslaved laborer sues for their freedom and wins. Similarly, in Knight versus Wedderburn in 78. And the other element here is, well, enslaved laborers are suing for their freedom and winning. Abolitionist sentiment is growing in England, and it's seen as a way to potentially, push back against French power, because the English, it's not like they're so enlightened, right? A lot of English, and sure, some English abolitionists are, believe in the humanity of enslaved Africans, but others understand that the French, their system of enslaved labor is so brutal that they have to constantly import new enslaved laborers, and they're engaging in actually a black market in Haiti in particular. So the English say, well, if we abolish the slave trade, we stop that black market, and Haiti can't compete anymore. So that is another kind of reason why abolitionist sentiment starts to grow, actually, as kind of a political strategy to push back against the power of the French. American Revolution. So it's happening. We move forward to the American Revolution, and you have this English sentiment, this English abolitionist sentiment emerges during the Revolution with Dunmore's proclamation. John Dunmore was the royal governor of Virginia. He declares martial law, and he says that if enslaved laborers will fight for the side of the English, that they will get their freedom. And it scares the crap out of Virginians. And similarly, Washington responds that he will re-enlist black troops. So almost as like a political move, right? So black troops initially could fight in the Continental Army, but they couldn't re-enlist because there was complaints. So Washington gets rid of that to counter Dunmore's proclamation, saying, effectively trying to say, right, we also value um, uh, enslaved or enslaved fighters. I mean, it doesn't. That doesn't. That's not actually true. But he tries it. Okay. So the revolution happens. The war is won. We have the Articles of Confederation. No one cares about that. We move forward to the Constitutional Convention to make a real governing document. And what do they do about slavery? Not much. So in Article 1, Section 9, they say that the transatlantic slave trade will be abolished in 1808. So give you a little time to kind of increase the amount of enslaved laborers in the South. This is, I mean, whatever. I mean, for AP review, this is not important, but this is always something that is very aggravating for me. There's a certain variety of like small-minded pedant that says like, well, actually, point of fact, nowhere in the Constitution does they use the word slave or slavery, as though that somehow suggests that like it didn't justify slavery because they don't use that exact word. Like, I mean, the myopic thinking of this is kind of almost mind blowing. But I guess some people are really that small minded. No, it doesn't matter if you don't say the word slave, right? So when you see such persons as any other state's existing shall think property, this is talking about slavery, right? The importation of laborers is about slavery. Article 1, Section 2. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. That's the 3/5 clause. So that is saying enslaved laborers, because they know what they're talking about, enslaved laborers count as 3/5 for kind of congressional apportionment, congressional representation. So this is kind of punting, right? So it's not the 2/5 clause, right? It's the 3/5 clause. So it does favor the southern states, but the southern states would have wanted, as here we have Governor Morris complaining about all of this. Governor Morris, he's not the governor of Pennsylvania. His name is Governor. Effectively saying in this quote, if they're going to be 100%, they should either be 100% people and free and counted for congressional representation, or you shouldn't have them at all, right? One way or another. That like you can't have it both ways, right? If you're going to have these people here, then they should, and you're going to count them as citizens, they should be free citizens. And if you don't want to count them, then they shouldn't be here at all, right? Charles Pinckney, classic like freshman year argument, right? Since the beginning of time, it's been this way, so it should be that way. That is a logical fallacy, but no one stops Pinckney from advancing it. Cites Greece had slaves, Rome had slaves. Again, fundamentally ignoring the difference here, right? And people do this still. I mean, idiots still make these arguments, right? That like, oh, slavery since the beginning of time. Again, race-based, heritable slavery, it's different. It's fundamentally different from what Greece and Rome had. Pinckney is responsible for adding Article 4, Section 2, which is effectively the first fugitive slave law. Give the devil his due. Pinckney is also responsible for Article 6, Section 3, which basically says, right, you shouldn't have a religious test to serve in office. So, not all bad. Okay, centuries-long genocide, part 2. Slavery is decreasing in the late 1700s, but it starts to increase in the 1800s because of the, say it with me now, cotton gin. Eli Whitney, invention of the cotton gin, makes cotton incredibly profitable. And you see then, right? So the perspective of 1783 is slavery is decreasing. By the time we get to the 1790s, certainly 1800, slavery is going this way, not that way. Now we got a problem on our hands. The justification for slavery shifts from a patriarchal justification to a paternalist one. That is to say, the patriarchal economic necessity is like we need these to have a strong economy. We need this kind of labor. There's no choice. We just need to do it. Right? Doesn't matter. Right? What the qualms are. Right? We need to do this because it actually helps the economy. I am the enslaver. I know what's right. I'm the boss. That's what we need to do. As opposed to a paternalist one, which we'll start to see emerge in the 1800s, which is to say, look, we love these people. They're parts of our family. They're better off than they were in Africa. We're helping them. We take care of the children. We take care of the elderly, right? This kind of notion of, love. Again, the numbers increasing dramatically from the turn of the century into the mid 1800s. By the mid 1800s, you start to see what is known as the internal slave trade. Ding, 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 ding. Important stuff to remember. Internal slave trade is not just enslaved laborers from Africa or from the Caribbean, but enslaved laborers from the old colonies, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, Georgia, being sent down the river to the new states, right, in the deep South. And you have here, right, that half to two-thirds of the cotton supply is produced in the United States. So it is there's a big need for enslaved laborers. Importantly here, lastly, that the South develops, there's this notion that New England or the Lowell system or whatever, they develop kind of scientific management and kind of like kind of capitalist modes of labor maximization and productivity. It's actually not true. In the last 15 years, scholars have pointed out very forcefully and correctly that quotas, time management, labor pushing, competition between laborers for like maximum output, all of the stuff that we associate with New England and Yankee ingenuity actually was a part of the labor exploitation in the South, on labor camps in the 19th century. And then that actually is exported to the North. Okay. Race in the South. Because it's an addiction. So they're so wedded to and reliant upon the quick profits of enslaved labor that there's no money for industrialization. There's no money for education. There's less incentive why would you diversify your economy when you have a cash cow? Why would you industrialize when you're making money hand over fist with cotton agriculture? Why would you innovate when the thing you're doing works? So this is a problem, right? So they have a racism problem. They have a addiction to slavery problem in the South. But the other important thing that happens here is that because there's slavery, poor whites see themselves as higher up on the social ladder. So they're not demanding higher wages necessarily like the industrialized or industrializing laborers in the North are. They're not demanding free public education like the industrialized and industrializing laborers of the North are. And the economy isn't growing and adapting. There's not that much immigration to the South anyway. So slavery is this way of pulling apart poor white and enslaved black, two groups of people who actually do have, a lot of things in common. Okay, abolition. Abolition is a Black Lives Matter movement, the original Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter in 1850, in 1860, in 1960, and in 2021. And we see this history very clearly when we look at the 19th century. There are free black communities that exist, and they are very important, but they're pretty small. They're marginalized. They're economically always at risk. They do some major things like founding the AME Church in 1816. This is a Baptist church which is very central to Black Americans, both Southern and Northern. However, they really are trying to secure, right, kind of this is like a respectability politics 1.0. More than anything, they want to be accepted in white society, right? Especially in the North, they want to be accepted in white society. And that's fine given the kind of racial hierarchies of the time. But they're not as radical, certainly, as people like Nat Turner, who is an enslaved laborer, who is the leader of a slave rebellion, kills several dozen Virginians, I think 31 some Virginians or 20 some Virginians, in 1831, and really is responsible for pointing out to Southern enslavers, these people don't like you. And they're not happy. You might convince yourself that you have this paternalist system that benefits the enslaved, but as it turns out, not really, right? The enslavers in the South, because they're unable to understand, again, this is agency. Black agency, part of agency is not just playing a banjo and growing rice, but it's like saying, like, I'm going to kill this person that's responsible for enslaving me and my family. White enslavers are incapable of seeing that. They blame white Northern abolitionists for radicalizing them, things like that. Black abolitionists, most famously Frederick Douglass. He is on the speaker circuit or lyceum circuit, spreading his message of abolition throughout the North. Harriet Tubman, central figure to the Underground Railroad, moves enslaved laborers from the South to the North and ultimately to Canada. A lot of free formerly enslaved laborers understood that the United States was still not safe, even in the North. That if you had to go, if you really wanted to be sure you were safe, you had to go to Canada. David Walker, Walker's Appeal, which is his publication published in the mid 19th century, helps radicalize the movement. Is demanding a more radical response for abolition against slavery. And then there are white abolitionists located along a spectrum from like the American Colonization Society, to the American Abolition Society, who, like, American Colonization Society says, like, we should end slavery and send all black people back to Africa. Like, that's not exactly like racially enlightened, right? It's still a fundamentally racist movement. They don't like slavery, but they also don't like black people. Right, so like just to think abolition anti-racist is not accurate at all. The anti-racists, so like William Lloyd Garrison or the Grimke sisters, were very, very rare. So Garrison was a radical, published The Liberator was the publication that he put out. And then the Grimke sisters were born into a family of enslavers in the South, in South Carolina, and they move north and they come out actually against slavery, which goes to show, again, you can't choose your parents, but you can choose your politics. And the Grimke sisters are a very good example of them saying, like, just because our family says slavery is normal and natural and right, we're smart enough to know that that's not true. And indeed they were. Okay, not everyone is happy with abolition, obviously. Everyone, for us all in the 20th century, 21st century, we all think we would, of course I'd be against, slavery. If I was around in the 1850s, of course I'd be, with the Grimke sisters or, Frederick Douglass or whatever. No, you wouldn't. Statistically speaking, you would not. Only 10% of Northerners support abolition. That is a minuscule amount of people. So the chances are you would have not been against slavery. Um, so that's not to like shame you, but it's to give you a sense of like, you know, it's very in any given historical period. It is difficult, and indeed, it takes a lot of courage to speak out against the injustices of that period. So we can look back through time and see the injustices of the past and say, oh, I would have, but we probably wouldn't have. And similarly, people in the future will look back on our time and say, I would have, but they probably wouldn't have. And we probably wouldn't either. You know, I mean, who knows? Social movements are always unpopular. If a social movement was popular, it wouldn't be a social movement. It would just be like a thing people think, right? So that is always the case, right? That a lot of social movements are minoritarian insofar as a minority of people support them. There's all kinds of arguments that anti-abolitionists kind of put forward. There's the constitutional one. You know, this is private property. It's not about race, right? It's not about, you know, any kind of racial animosity, but the Constitution declares that we have private property rights and private property, right? So there's that argument. There's the federalist argument. I live in a state that allows slavery and states have states' rights and the federal government. Okay, fine. There's an economic argument about job competition, right? That like you can't have if these people were, you know, free, that it is actually beneficial to have enslaved laborers. And then there's just a straight up like racist argument. The racist argument of like I don't like black people or like I think they're inferior is obviously an individualized kind of racism. I individual think this thing. These other ones are structural, right? So like you could definitely like wholeheartedly believe that the Constitution and federalism guarantee you the right to have enslaved laborers. And you're not wrong. You're not wrong, right? That's a structural racist problem, right? That like doesn't matter what I personally think, the larger systems, larger structures say the thing I'm doing is legal, so I'm going to do it. That's structural racism, right? So, like, it is like that's what it looks like when you have constitutional, federal, economic arguments that totally justify slavery. Have nothing to do with your own personal feelings. That is a structural issue. Okay. The Black South. Enslaved laborers do develop a kind of working class, because they're not industrial laborers. We kind of have to put it in like in shutter quotes. But they're certainly laborers that identify as laborers. And like working class identity, right? The notion of working class identity is that like we're not ever going to be those people. We're not ever going to be Andrew Carnegie or Rockefeller. That's a joke. It's a fantasy. So we might as well not buy in to some fantasy and just try to advocate for ourselves as a class of people, right? So obviously with slavery, that is very, very clear. You're never going to, you're a slave, right? You're enslaved and you're not going to be free. So you might as well push for your rights as much as you can. Again, Virginia versus South Carolina here. You have Virginia creating a kind of like African and American culture because of the form of enslaved labor that they had. Because it's a self-sustaining population, you have 2, 3, 4 generations that are born in Virginia, born in Maryland. Where in South Carolina, you have a constant influx of African and Caribbean laborers. You get a very different kind of like, it's more African, it's more Caribbean. Even the language that they speak is less kind of like English, proper English. In the Deep South, you get a new culture is only beginning to be forged, right, by the time we get to the Civil War. But suffice it to say that they're displaced, right, several times over, right, through, right, the transatlantic slave trade, and then down to the South. Some African, Yeah, so suffice it to say that white Southern culture, elite white Southern culture, is pretty kind of it's very much trying to emulate the royal culture of Europe. So it is inbred very much, which is not something that we see in enslaved communities. There's an incest taboo that is fairly common throughout them. So, like, they're not actually intermarrying with their cousins the way that white Southerners are. Um, their diets are are much further advanced, certainly than really any 19th century diet. They eat far more vegetables, not a lot of meat. So, what we understand in the kind of 21st century as a healthier diet because that's a West African tradition. And then they have this notion of fictive kinship, which keeps them right that like just because you're not blood related, you have still relatives, right? Aunties and uncles and like a larger cousins, a community that helps sustain well your community, right? Self-sustaining. Black culture is very much in the South defined by occupation, house workers versus field workers. The house workers in the domestic sphere were considered, or they consider themselves, higher class. They were often lighter skinned because they were more subject to sexual violence and and having children that were from the master, the enslaver, and an enslaved woman, where the field workers were lower class. They were darker skinned because it was just enslaved laborers intermarrying with each other. And you do begin to see a kind of what we would call colorism, that the lighter skinned house workers do start to look down upon the darker skinned field workers. So again, racism is very complicated and it is always changing and evolving through time. And obviously here we see an example of actually black on black, a kind of like, colorism taking place between these different enslaved groups. Okay, very quickly, pushing west, U.S. politics pushing west. In the North, the free soil movement is kind of a it's post-Whig. So the Whigs don't exist anymore. We don't have the Republicans yet. And the Free Soil Party is very much a party that is against slavery, right? So free soil, free labor, free men means just that, right? That that's the kind of they support a yeoman republic. They support the abolition of slavery and having just again free like cheap land available to agricultural laborers who are free, no slavery. In the South, we think about manifest destiny as something that emerges in the 1840s, and it certainly does in the southern states. But they're not just looking to Texas, they're also looking to Central America, to Mexico, and to Cuba, big time, in terms of where they want to expand is not just into the Spanish territories of the Southwest, but also into the Caribbean, because that's where the real money is. This notion of popular sovereignty emerges as a way, again, of punting on slavery, saying, well, let's just let local, municipalities decide on, whether they are or not. Turns out to be a bad idea. More on that in a second. Compromise of 1850. So California is a free state. They want to be admitted. Suddenly, you got a problem on your hands. The old great compromiser, Henry Clay, with one last great compromise. California is admitted as a free state. Utah and New Mexico are going to be popular sovereignty states. So there's a dub for popular sovereignty. Texas kind of is a wash. They get some debt forgiven, but they have to give away some of their territory. No slave trade in D.C., so that's a win for abolitionists. Re-up the fugitive slave law, that's a win for enslavers. So this is the Compromise of 1850. Again, we go back to the Constitutional Convention. We see how they punt on slavery in the 1780s. And you can only do this so many times before you're going to have a real problem on your hands. So the can is kicked down the road, down the road, down the road. Slavery is a moral wrong. It's never going to work. Enslaving other human beings is not a good idea. Race-based heritable slavery, not a good idea. But whether it be the Constitutional Convention or the Compromise of 1850, Northerners are afraid of Southerners, right? And they are very, as I said when I taught this the first time around, they want to appease the Southerners, right? So while these are compromises, they're also very much appeasing the kind of latent threats of the Southern states either seceding or nullifying or causing violence in some other kind of way. 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law is kind of passed or re-upped, really, which northern states don't like because they say it's a violation of states' rights. If a formerly enslaved person is living in New York for a decade, they're a New York citizen. So what are the Southerners to come up to New York and take that person and put them back into slavery? That's a violation of states' rights. It's also a very important shift from border patrol to internal enforcement, that you're no longer free once you reach a free state. You always, even a decade later, could be pulled back into slavery. Northern states do try to, find ways around this, but the Taney Court strikes them down. Underground Railroad, as I said, helps the flight ultimately to Canada. Also in 1850, 1852, 53, I think, is the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which draws a lot of Northern support because it really depicts in very graphic and kind of sentimental ways, right? It's very pulling at the heartstrings of the reader, how bad slavery is. Meanwhile, out west, you get Bleeding Kansas. Here is old John Brown, American hero he is, who bodies 20 pro-slavery border ruffians, him and his children, because that's what you get when you get popular sovereignty. The notion is that you'll fight it out in the ballot box. But why bother with the ballot box when you have bullets and you can just kill the people who will vote against you? That's what we see in Bleeding Kansas with border ruffians versus free soilers. We also know to not mess with John Brown and his kids because they're not playing. The difficulty setting is set to 0 because the border ruffians really aren't a match. Meanwhile, post Bleeding Kansas, we get the Dred Scott decision, 1857. This is an abolitionist case where Scott is enslaved. He sues for his freedom because he's lived as a free citizen in Illinois for 4 years and he doesn't want to go back to Missouri. Roger Taney, who is an enslaver, argues that just because Scott's black, he's not a citizen, and you can't sue. So the decision goes way beyond the scope of just deciding whether this guy is free, or if someone who goes from an enslaving state to a free state and then back is free or a slave, goes way, way, way beyond it, because he restricts citizenship to whites. So black people cannot be citizens. You don't have the privileges and immunities of citizenship if you're black. And that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional, right? Because if you are an enslaver and you have property and enslaved human beings, you can go wherever you want with them. Whether that's above or below the 3630 line. So this is a huge decision, right? Kind of and way beyond the scope of the particulars of the Dred Scott case. So Dred Scott decision 1853 or 57 is a very important Supreme Court decision and a huge step back for the rights of African Americans. Remember, I mean, this is the law, right? So, like, this is, again, when I talk about structural racism, this is structural racism. This is the law saying black people are not citizens, right? That's what it looks like. Okay, get to the Civil War. Um, yeah, not so great for the Confederate States of America. Um, uh, uh, they lose, obviously, big time. It is a war that is, oh, what are the many causes of the Civil War? There's one cause, it's slavery. Whether it's federalism, that's about slavery. If it's states' rights, that's about slavery. If it's about westward expansion, that's about slavery. All the cause of the Civil War is slavery. Racists don't know that they're racist. Again, white supremacy is seen as kind of natural, right? So it's not like people were like secretly knew that they were racist or like looked in the mirror and were like, I'm a racist. I'm like, that just was a natural thing. And again, this isn't to justify, this is not to justify or explain away their racism. They're racist. It's bad. It's inexcusable. Enslaved black people knew it was bad. Abolitionists knew it was bad. So it's not like no one knew, right? Plenty of people knew. It's just that they didn't want to admit that what they were doing was wrong. But how do they justify it? Well, it's about science. It's not about race. It's about science, right? And again, the latest science says in this time period that there's the white race or the Anglo-Saxon race, whatever that means, is superior. Or it's about property rights. It's about paternalism. These people are better off. We actually love them, right? And they're happy with us. They're better off than they were in Africa. That wage labor in the North, look what's happening in the North. Children are getting crushed under, in factories, and people, get killed on the job, and there's nothing, their families are out of luck. Like, this system is better. We take care of old people. We take care of the children, the enslavers say, right? So like, here's a image from, this is actually from some archival research that I had done, and that you see here. July 4th, 1862. So you have Yankees celebrating the 4th, perfect burlesque. They who have trampled upon our liberty and the Constitution. So these people believe that they're on the right side of history. They're wrong. These people believe that they are doing what's best for enslaved laborers. They're wrong. These people believe that they are, morally superior to the North. Look, you could say the North is also, morally suspect when it comes to the rights of laborers, but certainly the South, they're wrong, right? Again, this is not to justify or to explain away slavery, but it's to say racists don't know they're racist. Right, that racists use whether it's 1862 or 2021, there's all kinds of reasons you can justify the thing you think. That's not just like when you get home and you shut the door and you look in the mirror, you go, ha 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 ha. I said it was about science. I said it was about property rights, but I'm really secretly a racist. No, it's delusion. You're delusional, and you're wrong. Okay. Race and war. Here we have the famous Jefferson Davis statue in Virginia, which was transformed into a George Floyd memorial. So if there ever was a piece of history that is continuity and change, living history, it is that. The Emancipation Proclamations, Union American generals, again, just as a little reminder, when we talk about the Civil War, it's only a civil war because the Confederate States of America lose. The Confederate States of America are their own country with their own, they want to be their own country. They've got their own flag. They've got their own money. They've got their own president. That's a different country. So it is a civil war because they lose. But as far as we're concerned, in 1861-3, the United States of America is fighting against the Confederate States of America. The Confederate States of America are a different country, and they lose. American generals from the American Army start passing emancipation proclamations, effectively saying, what are we going to do? All these, we move into Confederate territory, and you have all these enslaved laborers rushing towards us. What do we do with them? We're going to seize them as contraband, and we're going to emancipate them and put them to work on bases. In 1862 September, the Emancipation Proclamation is delivered by Lincoln. Pays a political price in the midterms, but again, a lot of people say that emancipation is really, really radical. Emancipation Proclamation doesn't really free anyone. Largely, border states excluded. Enslaved laborers in the Confederate States of America are the ones that are, the Emancipation Proclamation is directed towards. But that's another country, again. So, like, the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't have any force of law when it's delivered. Fort Pillow Massacre, 1864. Confederates massacre 300 black soldiers who were trying to surrender. There's all kinds of racial fears of black people becoming free. The biggest one being miscegenation or race mixing, which is never actually borne out in reality in the South, but again, it's used as a racist trope to subjugate black people, black men in particular. Sherman's Land Special Field Order number 15 attempts to give the formerly enslaved, land to farm and to become independent. This is like the beginning of 40 Acres and a Mule. This is in the 1860s. This is the first attempt at a notion of reparations, of repairing the damage that had been done by hundreds of years of slavery, and it is rescinded by Andrew Johnson, the racist president who takes over after Lincoln is assassinated. So we are still, these debates are still ongoing. Last slide. I'm over, what did I say, 50, how many minutes? 53? I'm at, I think, an hour and 1 minute. 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment. So let's get ahead of ourselves here. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. These are easy to remember. You have slavery. You want to get rid of slavery. What's the first thing you need to do? Abolish slavery. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. What does that mean? It effectively is the seizing or expropriation of what is now $3 trillion. I know that doesn't seem much after like the stimmy money machine go burr of COVID, but that's a lot of money, right? And that is not compensated. So enslavers are not compensated for their loss. And what is it? The language of the amendment: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. That subordinate clause there is later used to effectively recreate as close as the South can get. You can charge someone of a crime, some trumped up, charge. Jury, all white jury, convicts them. Now you've got someone who's been duly convicted of a crime, and you can lease them out for convict labor. 14th Amendment. So, okay, got rid of slavery, but what haven't you done? You haven't defined who these people are. So they're citizens. Bing. The Wong Kim Ark decision in 1898 takes the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment and applies it to people born in the United States. Again, there's nothing in the 14th Amendment that says like these formerly enslaved people, right? It's about just people. So Wong Kim Ark decides the decision, the holding of that Supreme Court case establishes birthright citizenship. The Due Process Clause is limited by the Colfax decision, the Colfax massacres in the late 19th century. It's white Southerners murdering black folks, and the federal charge is that these white people are violating the due process, right? That you can't just kill people, right? Someone has to go to, right? If someone's convicted of charged with a crime, they've got to go to trial and be convicted or whatever. You can't just kill them. The Colfax decision decides in favor of the white murderers. So the due process clause is severely limited by that. And then the equal protection clause is interesting because it is both used to justify Jim Crow with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which establishes right separate but equal as constitutionally okay, right? As long as it's, again, equal protection. You can have separate as long as they're equal. So that's what Plessy decides in 1896. And then by the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, it's become obviously, right, it's become very obvious that they're separate and very not equal. Okay, so you abolish slavery, you created citizenship, due process, equal protection, but what about the last thing, voting and universal male suffrage is the 15th Amendment. Women have to wait until the 19th Amendment in 1919, and this actually does cause a big rift between the suffrage movement and the abolitionist movement, which before were very tightly linked. But again, this is how kind of political hegemony works. When one group, right, the promise of being let into the political mainstream, the political establishment is held out to one group, they're going to take it. And they're going to break ties with the groups that helped support them. And that's what we see between abolition and suffrage. But those are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Very big deal. Very easy to remember. Get rid of slavery, citizenship, voting. There's no way you can get those out of order. You can't give someone the vote before you get rid of slavery or establish citizenship. So very clearly, we shouldn't be forgetting these amendments. An hour and 5 minutes. So I was a little off in terms of my estimation, but I kind of went on a couple times. So pretty good, all things considered. You better watch this darn thing because it's cost me, an hour of my life. Here you go. Let me know when you have questions. If you have questions, if you watch this is important stuff. If we're talking about slavery, it's kind of a big deal in American history. So watch, take notes, pay attention, and good luck.